Hello, my lovely aspiring fiction authors. Today I want to know, are you somebody who's really struggling to finish the first draft of your novel? Like struggling to fill in the plot, the end, maybe you're not sure how it's going to end, or you're trying to decide between a few different endings. Maybe you don't know exactly where to start it, or maybe it's filling in the saggy middle. We all know that can be a challenge. Or maybe it's transitioning between big plot events that you already do have planned. Or maybe you're just blocked in general and don't know what happens next. If you have ever experienced this before, and especially if you're experiencing it now with any of your works in progress, this is the episode for you. I'm going to give you the top 3 reasons this is happening and what to do about them. So stay tuned. Okay, so the top 3 reasons why it's hard to finish the first draft of any manuscript are as follows. Number 1, not being intentional enough about what something looks like. Number 2, just doing whatever you want in whatever order you want and trying to fill in the gaps on the fly rather than following more of a recipe. And number 3, not using intentionality and specificity to create emotion. Okay, so let's dive into these in a little more detail. I promise I will explain them and not just be like, the end. Okay, so mistake number 1, not being intentional enough about what something should look like. What I mean by this is that you have some idea what you want your story to be, right? I know that you do. And maybe you don't know exactly what all the events are going to be, but there's some premise that came together for you. You know what the characters will be, or maybe you don't know the characters, but you know what one scene will be. You know, whatever the case is, however you came up with this particular story, you know what some of it is, right? Here's the thing, your story and all the reasons for your story, all of the emotion, all of the logic, everything about your story is living in your subconscious mind. But when you sit down to actually write words on the page, suddenly you kind of get blocked as to what the events of your story should actually be. You want it to be unique. You want it to be epic. You want everybody to like it. So why is it so hard to get the events down, right? Well, number 1, and this is actually sort of a bonus thing, it's at least partly because you're putting so much pressure on yourself, right? It's kind of like what I talk about sometimes about trying to force the muse. When you're trying to force it out of your brain, everything's going to seize up and you're not going to be able to get anything done. You've got to relax your brain and let the ideas flow. But there's a more underlying reason that that's happening, a more underlying reason that your brain is not relaxing, that it's tensing up and not giving you all of the flow that you want for your story. And that is simply that you are not tapping into your subconscious mind. Okay, I want you to think of let's think about creating a description. I'm going to talk about something here that is it's not always what I talk about when it comes to the subconscious mind. It's sort of adjacent to that, but it's really important. And that is simply that when you start brainstorming how things should look, you have to be very specific and intentional, and your subconscious mind will help you do this. So I want you to imagine for a minute someone trying to describe what the sky looks like at sunset. Now, the non-descriptive person who is not very great with words and maybe doesn't want to be a writer would probably look up and go, oh, it's blue and pink. And that's probably all they would say. But that's not terribly impressive. I mean, we all can imagine what those colors look like in our heads, but when somebody says that, all I see is like a blue square and a pink square. It doesn't really show me what the sky looks like, right? Now, let's say that you ask either a writer or possibly an artist who's really good with colors. They may say something more like, well, over there, you know, in the east, it's still a light blue color, but as it heads this way, it kind of fades or morphs, if you will, into more of a purple. And everything fades into itself. It's hard to say where one color ends and another begins. And then as you get closer to where the sun is actually setting, it turns pink. And there's like different hues of baby pink and bubblegum pink and fuchsia and all these colors. And there's these striated clouds that are in formations along the sky that look like they're kind of petering out, and they're gray and white, and on the underside they're kind of pink from the sun. And you see how obviously the second description is much better and much more descriptive and everything. But what was really different between the two? It's not just the details. Like, think deeper than that. It's about what does the pink and blue actually look like? How would I use words to describe what this looks like, right? And that's the biggest difference in the two descriptions. One is just saying what they are. It's kind of telling, I guess you could say, telling us that it's blue and pink. The other is showing us with words what this person is actually seeing in the sky. And that's the idea behind tapping into your subconscious mind. It really is. Something that psychologists of the 90s actually got right is that there are things hidden in our subconscious minds that are important that we are not consciously aware of. That's why it's called the subconscious mind, right? And we need to bring those things out of our subconscious mind and into our conscious mind, and that way we can write about them on the page. So one of the things that you can do, and that very often authors do not do, is to tap into your subconscious mind through journaling or brainstorming and come up with what something actually looks like. Now, I'm not always even just talking about descriptions. There is that, and that's a great way to use it. But I'm even talking about plot events. So if you're saying, I am writing a story that is Beauty and the Beast retelling set in, I don't know, an African biker gang or something, then you need to sit down and say, what does this actually look like? And we're talking about events here. You know, how would Beauty come across the Beast? You know, what are the attributes of Beauty and the Beast in that setting and in that cultural dynamic? You know, what is it going to look like in terms of him locking her away in the castle? What is that going to look like in your story? Go through the events as you know what they are and say, what is this actually going to look like in the story? Like, what is actually going to happen? What events would illustrate that theme that I'm trying to bring across? You see what I mean? And if you just relax your brain and let the ideas flow, believe me, they will flow. Your subconscious mind will give you answers to all those questions. And that is something that most authors are simply not doing. Okay, so that's the first mistake, is not being intentional about how something looks. And yes, that can mean description, but also the events of your story. How is it actually going to play out in the story? All right, let's move on to the second mistake. When it comes to filling out the events of your story, right, you may just be doing this willy-nilly without much intentionality. And that's a problem too. Now, once again, you probably know some of the events of your story, which is great. Those are great jumping off points. But unless the story came to you fully formed and fleshed out, you're going to have some gaps to fill in and some things that you need to figure out. That's how most people write their stories. But here's the thing. You really need to be intentional about not only what's going in your story, but where it's going, okay? I am getting ready to start watching the next season of The Great British Baking Show. It's actually, there's a bunch of episodes on Netflix right now, but I wanted to wait until most of them were on there because I like to binge it. I don't like to wait week to week. But one of my favorite shows, it's so much fun to watch. And every single week they do what's called a technical challenge. And this is a challenge that's created to see how good the bakers are at food science. And how they do that is they don't give them a recipe. They just have to intuitively have some understanding about how to combine ingredients and maybe what goes in particular types of dishes. And then they have to try and come up with whatever recipe they've been given. But literally, they don't have the recipe. They have ingredients, and it'll say something like, make the dough. And it doesn't tell them how much to put in or in what order or anything like that. And this is like the challenge that's the hardest for the bakers. They all hate it because it's so hard and they're always second guessing what they're doing. But here's what I'm going to compare it to. You probably see where I'm going with this. When you're just throwing out events willy-nilly in your story, it's kind of like doing the technical challenge on the Great British Baking Show, right? You don't have a recipe for where things need to go. Now, I know that there are some of you out there, don't lie, who are recoiling because I'm talking about a recipe when we're writing fiction and you don't like that. And I understand, but this is probably, what I mean is probably different than you think. I'm not even really talking about a template like the hero's journey. Those can be great, but really I'm talking more about the emotional journey of the character, and I'm talking about cause and effect a lot. If you just, so many authors, they have these scenes in mind that they want to do. And again, I am all for whatever scenes have come to mind so far for you. I mean, that's what you've built your story on, so they're going to be very, very powerful for your story. But then they'll just sort of loosely knit them together and hope it all works. And sometimes it does. But much like the technical challenge, sometimes even though you get something that's mostly right, it's also a little bit off. Like it doesn't set up quite right. The texture is a little wrong. Maybe you didn't bake it all the way. So it is right-ish, but it's not great. And I don't want anyone to describe your story that way, okay? We need to be more intentional and follow more of a recipe. And this is the recipe that I call the transformational human psychology. I talked all about this last episode, so if you want more of a deep dive into what that is, go back and listen to the previous episode. But basically, you want to use the way that human beings change. And we're talking about going through any change you can imagine, whether it's just learning to tie your shoe or going through some massive spiritual or physical or emotional change, okay? The sequence is always the same. And if you use that as a guide to lead your character and therefore your reader through the story, it will be so much more powerful for them. Not only will you be automatically creating way more emotion, and they will automatically be really invested in it because on a subconscious level, they recognize the journey, but it will also make perfect sense because there becomes sort of a cause and effect thing that's going on, so that by the time you get to the final scene, it feels like it's fate or destiny that the character ended up there. And those are the kinds of stories that create a lot of emotion, a lot of catharsis, and that readers love to read, okay? So if you're not doing that, then you're leaving a lot of emotion on the table, and it's also making it really hard for you to finish your manuscript. Because without that, you just go, okay, where do I go now? And okay, should this happen next? Does that make sense? Yeah, I guess it does. No, don't do that. Follow the process, follow the recipe so that you end up with the perfect, delectable story that every reader wants, okay? And then finally, we get to the third mistake, which is not using intentionality and specificity to create emotion. Okay, so in terms of the plot events in your first draft of your manuscript, this actually goes hands in hand with what I talked about in the first mistake. By figuring out what something looks like, you are using intentionality and specificity, right? You're being intentional about what you're actually going to show in your story, and specificity is like what exactly it's going to look like, right? But here's the thing. All of that, using intentionality and specificity, if I can speak, creates emotion. You have to understand that. So think about the description of the sky that I talked about. Even though you might not be aware of this on a conscious level, and I guess you will be now that I'm telling you, the difference between the two, you know, if I tried to say, well, yeah, but why is the second description better than the first description? Well, because it's more descriptive. Well, yeah, but why is that better? Because I can just picture it better. Okay, but why is that better? You know what I mean? Just keep drilling down like that. And what it really comes down to is that when we can see it like that, when we can envision it in our mind, and of course this goes for all the senses, if we can smell it, if we can taste it, that sort of thing, it puts us into the experience itself, and that creates emotion. We're having an emotional reaction to that sky because we've all seen a sky like that, and we probably have, you know, subconscious memories and emotions that come along with having witnessed a sky like that before. And so even though it's not a huge emotion, most of us are not going to break down crying upon reading that description or get angry or anything like that. What we don't understand is that that is creating emotion for us. So you need to use the intentionality and specificity both for your story events to fill out your plot, but you also need to use it on a sentence level. I'm going to tell you guys a little secret here. Any story and any sentence can be emotional and epic. It's all in the execution. Okay, so you might say, well, you know, I saw this one, I don't know, TV show or Netflix show, and I just thought it was really boring and dumb. Like the premise was pretty good, but then I was just bored with it. Okay, but you could take that premise and you could make it better, right? It's all going to be about the execution. And the difference in the execution is how much emotion is being created, you know, during that particular execution of the premise. So again, you can create a ton of emotion if you are following the script for human transformational psychology, right? That will automatically, in terms of the events and what happens, will create emotion for your audience because they're going to be so satisfied by the turn that the story takes, by the events that play out, right? Now, when it comes to writing on a sentence level, any sentence at all can be made into an emotional sentence, right? So even if you have a super boring sentence, like, if we go back to the description, the sky is blue and pink, okay? Super boring, not creating much emotion. But if you then put specificity and emotional words into your sentences, boy, does that transform the sentence, okay? So if you're not doing this, if you're not using specificity and intentionality to both figure out your plot, and secondly, to write your sentences, this is another reason why it's hard for you to finish your manuscript. I mean, it's hard on the one level because you don't know what to write, right? You don't even know what the events are. You don't know what it's going to look like. But the other thing that I have found is that every once in a while, this happens to everybody, we'll get in a little bit of a rut and we'll have a scene that we're not that excited to write. Maybe it's not one of the big scenes. Maybe it's not one of the most emotional scenes. We're excited to write other scenes. And so we kind of put this one off and, keep writing other scenes instead of this one. But when it comes right down to it, we have to buckle down and write the scene. For me, I found that if I just find a way to put emotion into that scene, suddenly it becomes just as fun to write as anything else, even if it's not a big scene with big events and big emotions. And how do I do that? I sit down and I figure out what emotions I can pull out of the scene. So one trick would be to look at all of the characters that are in the scene and what's going on and say, what is this character feeling? And then find a way to up-level that emotion, to pull it out, to make it stronger, and to communicate it really effectively, read emotionally, to the reader, right? And then the other thing is just to write really beautiful emotional sentences. Once I start doing those two things, the most boring scene in my whole book where somebody's like sitting in the corner staring at the wall suddenly becomes really fun to write because it is emotional, because I'm being specific, because I've figured out exactly what this is going to look like, and I'm putting emotion into the events of the scene and also into my sentences. Okay, so I guess what it comes down to, if you're having trouble finishing your first rough draft, is number one, do you know what all the events will be? Remember that it's going to be so much easier to sit down and write the words if you already know what's going to happen, if you have at least a rough outline. And the best way I can tell you to do that is to use transformational human psychology to figure it out. Once you have that, you're never going to get stuck again, I promise, because you'll always know not exactly what's going to happen, but kind of the step that needs to happen. And then you just figure out what that is for your character and your story. And once you tap into your subconscious creativity, it will just take you in so many different directions. You're going to have a different problem. It's not going to be that you can't finish your manuscript. It's going to be that you have so many ideas to choose from that you actually have a difficult choice to make, right? And yes, that can be hard too, but it is a good problem to have. Then if that's not the case, if you know what you're going to write and you're pretty sure that's what it's going to be, then you need to ask yourself, maybe if the reason you're not excited to write it or you can't seem to buckle down and write it is because there's not enough emotion in it. One thing that I hear from a lot of authors is that they will create an outline. They'll try to be, and the reason they're doing that is to try and be intentional and do the planning beforehand so they're not always like going off the rails and pantsing the whole thing. But then the complaint that I hear is that once they get going, they can't seem to stick to their outline. Now, part of that, I have addressed this before, part of that is that they didn't use their subconscious creativity to create their outline. They were probably using their conscious mind. And then once they start writing, the subconscious begins to flow and gives you way better ideas than you put in your outline. So that could be part of it. But the other part could be that once you start writing, you think of all these emotional things that you want to put into your story. And of course, that's better than just the dry, Bob goes to the store in this chapter, or whatever the case may be. But the thing is, you can infuse that emotion into your story by simply looking at the scene and saying, okay, who's feeling what emotion? What do I need to bring out? And how can I make the way that I'm describing it, my actual sentences, feel very emotional? And if you do that, you will be so excited to write every single scene in every single manuscript that you ever come up with, all right? So let's go over these mistakes one more time and how to fix them just as a recap, okay? So mistake number one is not being intentional about what something actually looks like in your story. And how you fix this is that you tap into your subconscious creativity, you start letting the ideas flow, and you become very logical about how to describe things. What will it actually look like in your story? Mistake number two is not following some sort of recipe so that you get a perfect emotional story at the end, rather than the last place baker in the Great British Baking Show Technical Challenge who ends up with this pile of burnt mush that nobody wants to eat, right? And how you do that is just by using transformational human psychology so that you always know what in general needs to happen next, and then you can journal and brainstorm over what that looks like for your story. And then you'll never be stuck. You'll never not know what comes next, okay? You'll always know what needs to come next, and then you just got to figure out the details. And mistake number 3 is not being intentional enough or specific enough to create emotion. Remember, you can always ask, what emotions are the people in this scene feeling? How can I bring them out more? And how can I make my sentences, the way I'm actually describing things on the page, more emotional, more specific, more detailed, and just funner to write, right? All right, so I hope that this has been helpful to you. If you are having trouble finishing the first draft of your manuscript, whether this is your first book that you've ever written or the 15th, things like this can be really helpful when you get stuck. And once again, if you need help with this, I would invite you to join us inside the Legendary Fiction Forge. Inside the Forge, I teach you how to do this in great detail. I teach you exactly how to tap into your subconscious mind. I give you journal prompts so you know exactly what to journal on, the questions to ask, so that you can really flesh out your story really well. And because it's coming from your subconscious mind, it will always be your unique story, your soul story, as I like to say. I teach human transformational psychology in great detail. Just this past week, the beginning of November, I put the full internal arc, beginning to end, for the character in there. And next month, we're going to be going into plotting, which I'm really, really excited about. And I teach you other things as well, like how to edit for passive voice. Getting rid of the passive voice definitely makes your sentences more emotional. And I have some marketing in there, and there's just all kinds of stuff. So if that is any of that is stuff that you think would be helpful to you in getting your story written or marketing it or any of the things you got to do as a fiction author, then again, I invite you to join us inside the Forge. And let me remind you one more time that normally I have an annual membership, so you pay for 12 months at a time, and I give you a break on that. So if you'll pay for 12 months, I only charge you for 10, so you're getting 2 months free. But through the end of the year, I'm actually giving you an extra month free. So it's just a flat fee for the next 12 months, and you're actually getting 12 months for the price of 9. But that is only going to go through the end of the year, so if you want to hop on that, I would suggest you do it very soon. Talk to your hubby and see if maybe it can be an early Christmas present or something like that. And yeah, I hope to see you inside. But either way, I hope you all have a wonderful week of writing and that you can get those first draft manuscripts finished, and that most importantly, you find so much joy in doing it, because if you're not, what is the point of writing? Am I right? Okay, have a great week, you guys. I will be back next week with another podcast. And in terms of crafting 6-figure stories, may the odds be ever in your favor.